There is a document, sealed in wax, dated April 9, 1857, filed in the basement archives of Fairhope County Courthouse in southern Alabama. Most people who work there don't know it exists. Those who do rarely speak of it. The paper is yellowed, brittle at the edges. The ink has faded to a rust-brown color that looks disturbingly like dried blood. At the top, in careful script, are the words, "Last Will and Testament of Nathaniel Cornelius Ashford." Below that, in smaller letters, "To be read only upon confirmation of death." And below that, written in a different hand, shakier, more recent, "Do not open unless legally compelled." The will was read aloud once, only once, on a May afternoon in 1857, in the parlor of Ashford Hall, before an audience of 11 people. What happened in that room would be discussed in whispers for decades. It would fracture one of the wealthiest families in the South. It would ignite a legal war that consumed 7 years, destroyed reputations, and left a trail of ruin so deep that even now, more than a century and a half later, some descendants refuse to acknowledge it happened. The man who wrote that will owned 4,200 acres of prime cotton land. He owned a shipping interest in Mobile. He owned stock in 2 railways. He owned, according to the 1850 census, 143 human beings. His name appeared on donor lists for churches, hospitals, universities. He was described in regional newspapers as a pillar of Christian virtue, a devoted husband, a man of impeccable moral standing. And when he died, he left almost none of it to his wife. He left almost none of it to his 5 legitimate children. Instead, he left nearly everything to a woman named Celia, a woman the law classified as property, a woman who, until the moment of his death, had no legal right to own even the clothes she wore. This is not a story about redemption. It is not a love story. It is a story about what happens when a man who spent his entire life profiting from cruelty tries, at the very end, to buy his way out of guilt. It is a story about 2 women trapped in the same house, both destroyed by the same man, both forced to perform roles that required them to pretend the other did not exist. And it is a story about a system so deeply corrupted that even the attempt to escape it became another form of violence. Before we go further, you need to understand something. What you're about to hear is not an anomaly. It is not an exception. Cases like this happened more often than history admits. They were simply buried. Families paid lawyers to seal records. Courthouses conveniently lost documents. Descendants changed their names, moved west, rewrote their genealogies. The architecture of Southern society depended on silence, on everyone agreeing not to see what was plainly visible. And when that silence broke, as it did at Ashford Hall in May of 1857, the consequences were catastrophic. There are no living witnesses to what happened in that parlor, but there are letters, testimonies, court transcripts that were never meant to survive, journal entries written by people who could not bear to keep the truth inside them any longer. And if you read those documents carefully, if you let yourself sit with the weight of what they describe, you begin to understand that the real horror wasn't what Nathaniel Ashford did at the end of his life. It was what he did every single day before that. This is the story the South tried to forget. A story about inheritance, yes, about property, power, and law. But more than that, it is a story about what it means to live inside a lie so vast, so all-consuming, that even trying to tell the truth becomes an act of destruction. And the question it forces us to ask is this: can you undo a lifetime of evil with a single document? Can you free someone you spent years enslaving? Can guilt, no matter how genuine, ever be enough? Nathaniel Ashford thought it could. He was wrong, and the price of that mistake was paid by everyone he claimed to love. Let's begin where it all began. Not with the will, not with the death, but with the silence. The long, suffocating silence that everyone at Ashford Hall learned to live inside. Ashford Hall was built in 1823 on land purchased from Creek tribal territory after forced removal treaties cleared the way for white settlement. The house itself was a monument to theft dressed as civilization. 2 stories, federal-style architecture, 16 rooms, a grand staircase that curved like a question mark, gardens that required 12 people working full-time to maintain. From the upper windows you could see cotton fields stretching to the horizon, rows so straight they looked like scars carved into the earth. The house stood on a hill, deliberately elevated, so that everyone approaching it had to look up. Submission built into the landscape. Nathaniel's grandfather, Jonathan Ashford, had been the first to establish the family fortune. He'd arrived in Alabama in 1819 with money borrowed from northern banks and a willingness to do what others found distasteful. He bought land cheap, worked it brutally, and sold cotton at peaks the market hadn't seen before. By the time he died in 1840, he'd transformed the family name from obscure to untouchable. Nathaniel inherited the plantation when he was 26 years old. His father had died suddenly, drowned in the Tombigbee River under circumstances no one ever fully explained. There were rumors of debts, of threats from men Nathaniel's father had cheated in business deals, but nothing was proven, and the family closed ranks. Nathaniel took control of Ashford Hall in 1841, and within 3 years he doubled its productivity. He was brilliant with numbers, ruthless with labor, and capable of a charm that made people trust him even when they shouldn't have. By 1845, Ashford Hall was one of the most profitable plantations in the region, and Nathaniel was engaged to marry Catherine Marie Whitaker, the daughter of a federal judge. Catherine came from old Virginia money, the kind that spoke in polite euphemisms and never acknowledged where its wealth originated. She was 22 when she married Nathaniel, educated in literature and music, trained in the performance of Southern womanhood. Her role was clear: manage the household, bear children, maintain social connections, and never ask questions about the sources of her comfort. The wedding took place in November 1845. It was lavish. 200 guests, a reception that lasted 3 days. Newspapers described Catherine as radiant, Nathaniel as distinguished. The marriage was a merger as much as a union. Judge Whitaker's political connections, Nathaniel's expanding wealth. Together, they represented the aristocracy the South was building on a foundation of forced labor and legal violence. For the first year, Catherine performed her role flawlessly. She hosted dinners for county officials. She organized charity events for the church. She redecorated rooms at Ashford Hall with imported furniture and French wallpaper. She became pregnant in the spring of 1846 and gave birth to their first child, a son they named Jonathan, in January 1847. Everything appeared perfect. But Catherine was not stupid. She noticed things, small discrepancies, Nathaniel's absences in the evening, the way certain household servants avoided her eyes, the locked account books she was never allowed to see. And she noticed the woman who managed those books, a woman named Celia, who had been purchased by Nathaniel in the summer of 1844, 1 year before their marriage. Celia had been born enslaved on a Georgia plantation in 1822. Her mother had been a seamstress. Her father she never knew. By the time she was 12, she'd been sold twice. The second owner, a Charleston merchant, had taught her to read because he needed someone to manage his correspondence while he traveled. Literacy was dangerous for enslaved people, illegal in some states, but it made Celia valuable. She could write contracts, keep ledgers, draft business letters. When the merchant died in 1843, his estate was liquidated, and Celia was sold at auction in Mobile. Nathaniel Ashford purchased her for $1,800, nearly 3 times the average price. He told people he needed someone to organize Ashford Hall's increasingly complex financial operations. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Celia was 33 years old when Nathaniel died. That meant she'd lived at Ashford Hall for 13 years. She'd managed every account, tracked every expense, recorded every transaction. She knew more about the plantation's operations than Catherine ever would. She knew which debts were hidden, which investments were failing, which business partners Nathaniel had betrayed. And she knew other things, too. Things Catherine suspected but never confirmed. At least, not until the will was read. Celia lived in a small house near the main kitchen, not the slave quarters, a separate structure. 2 rooms, better windows, a fireplace, furnished with items that seemed too fine for someone classified as property. A desk, bookshelves, oil lamps. Nathaniel visited her there, often, late at night when the main house was asleep. Everyone knew, the other enslaved people at Ashford Hall, the overseers, the house staff. Everyone knew, but no one spoke of it. Speaking would make it real, and if it was real, then Catherine would have to acknowledge it. And if Catherine acknowledged it, she would have to act, and action would mean scandal, divorce, loss of status, financial ruin. So instead, Catherine performed ignorance. She smiled at social functions. She praised her husband's business acumen. She raised their children and pretended not to notice when Nathaniel disappeared into the darkness beyond the main house. In 1848, Celia gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Ruth. She had skin the color of honey, eyes that were startlingly pale, hair that curled in loose waves. The resemblance to Nathaniel was unmistakable. Catherine was pregnant with her second child at the time. She saw Ruth once, carried by another enslaved woman across the yard, and her face went completely blank. Later, she locked herself in her bedroom for 3 days. When she emerged, she acted as if nothing had happened, as if the child did not exist. Ruth would grow up in Celia's house, not in the quarters, never assigned field work, dressed better than other enslaved children, taught to read and write by her mother. A ghost child, visible but unacknowledged. In 1851, Celia had a son, Samuel. Same features, same ambiguous position. By 1854, she had another daughter, Grace. 3 children in 6 years, all bearing Nathaniel Ashford's face, all legally classified as his property. Catherine had 5 children by then: Jonathan, Mary, Charlotte, William, and Rebecca. Legitimate, white, heirs to everything. Or so they believed. The 2 families existed in parallel, one inside Ashford Hall, surrounded by wealth and legitimacy, one in the small house near the kitchen, surrounded by silence and danger. The children never played together, never spoke, but sometimes, at certain angles, in certain light, you could see how much the 2 sets of siblings looked alike. And everyone at Ashford Hall learned not to see it. Nathaniel Ashford began coughing blood in January 1857. At first, he dismissed it. Too much cigar smoke, a winter cold. But by February, the coughing was constant. By March, he couldn't stand without assistance. The doctor diagnosed consumption, tuberculosis, incurable, fatal. He had months at most. Catherine moved into a separate bedroom. She told people it was to avoid contagion. But everyone understood the real reason. She couldn't bear to be near him. Not anymore. Not after everything. Nathaniel spent his final weeks in a room overlooking the fields. He could see the cotton growing, see the people working it, people he owned, people whose labor had built everything he was about to leave behind. And he began to think about what that meant, about legacy, about judgment, about whether any of it had been worth it. He wrote letters during those weeks, letters to business partners, letters to his children, and one letter to an attorney named Samuel Pritchard. In that letter, Nathaniel outlined a will that would do something no one expected, something that would force everyone who knew him to confront truths they'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Nathaniel Ashford died on April 9, 1857. It was a Thursday, warm, the kind of spring day that makes death feel especially cruel. He died alone. Catherine had not visited him in 3 days. His children had been kept away, told their father needed rest. The only person in the room when he finally stopped breathing was an elderly enslaved man named Jacob, who'd served the family for 40 years. Jacob would later testify in court that Nathaniel's final words were, "Tell her I'm sorry." He didn't specify which her. The funeral was held on April 11th. Over 300 people attended. Ministers spoke of Nathaniel's contributions to the community, his generosity, his devotion to family, his unwavering Christian faith. Catherine sat in the front row, dressed in black silk, her face a mask of composed grief, her children beside her, all performing their roles perfectly. Celia did not attend the funeral. She remained in her house with Ruth, Samuel, and Grace, waiting, because Nathaniel had told her 3 weeks before he died that he'd changed his will. He hadn't told her what the changes were, only that she needed to be ready, that people were going to be angry, and that she needed to protect the children no matter what happened. The will reading was scheduled for May 3, 1857, 3 weeks after Nathaniel's death. Catherine insisted it be held at Ashford Hall, in the main parlor, where she could control the environment, where everything would proceed according to proper social order. 11 people gathered that afternoon: Catherine and her 5 children, Nathaniel's younger brother Thomas, a lawyer, Catherine's father, Judge Whitaker, Samuel Pritchard, the attorney who'd drafted the will, and 2 witnesses, respected merchants from the county. They expected a standard reading, the plantation divided among the legitimate children, provisions for Catherine as the widow, perhaps some charitable donations to the church. What they did not expect was what Samuel Pritchard actually read. Pritchard was 60 years old, gray-haired, known for his careful, methodical approach to law. He'd been Nathaniel's attorney for nearly 20 years, and as he broke the wax seal on the will that afternoon, his hands were shaking. He began with the standard language: declarations of sound mind, revocations of previous wills. Catherine relaxed slightly. Jonathan, the eldest son, leaned back in his chair, already imagining himself master of Ashford Hall. Then Pritchard reached the first bequest, and his voice changed, became strained, nearly inaudible. "To my wife, Catherine Marie Ashford," Pritchard read, his voice barely steady, "I leave the sum of $1 to be paid within 30 days of my death." The silence was immediate, absolute. Catherine's face went white. Her father, Judge Whitaker, half rose from his chair. Jonathan made a sound like he'd been struck. Pritchard continued, "To my children, Jonathan, Mary, Charlotte, William, and Rebecca, I leave the sum of $1 each, to be paid within 30 days of my death." Someone gasped. Mary started crying. Thomas, Nathaniel's brother, stood up. "This is insane. Sam, check the document again. There's been some mistake. This can't—" "Please," Pritchard said, his voice cracking. "Please let me finish." He looked at Catherine. What he saw in her face made him flinch. Then he read the primary bequest. "To Celia, a woman of approximately 33 years of age, currently held as property at Ashford Hall, I hereby grant immediate and unconditional freedom." Catherine's breathing became audible, short, sharp. "Furthermore, I grant to the aforementioned Celia the entirety of Ashford Hall Plantation, including all 4,200 acres of land, all buildings, all livestock, all equipment, all crop yields, current and future." Judge Whitaker stood. "This is forgery. This is—" "I further grant to Celia," Pritchard continued, his voice shaking, "my full ownership in Ashford Shipping Company, my shares in the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, my property holdings in the city of Mobile, all bank deposits, all bonds, all securities, and all currency in any form." The room exploded. Jonathan surged toward Pritchard. Thomas grabbed him. Catherine sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Because what Pritchard had just read wasn't just about money. It was about everything. Everything Catherine had believed was hers. Everything her children had been raised to expect. Gone. Given to a woman who'd been property the day before. Pritchard wasn't finished. There was more, and it was worse. "I further declare," he read, and now his hands trembled so violently the paper rattled, "that the following children, currently living at Ashford Hall, are my natural offspring, and are to be freed immediately upon my death. Ruth, age 9. Samuel, age 6. Grace, age 3. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes violence. Because what Pritchard had just read was not just an inheritance dispute. It was a public acknowledgement of what everyone had known and no one had said. That Nathaniel Ashford had fathered children with an enslaved woman. That those children existed. That they looked like him. That they were his. And now they were free. And wealthy. Catherine stood so abruptly her chair toppled backward. When she spoke, her voice was barely human. "Where is she?" No one answered. "Where is the woman who destroyed my life?" A voice came from the doorway, quiet, steady. "I'm right here." Every head turned. Celia stood in the entrance to the parlor. She wore a plain gray dress. Her posture was straight, her expression neutral. But there was something in her eyes, something that had been kept submerged for 13 years and was now, finally, surfacing. Catherine looked at her, and for the first time in over a decade, the two women truly saw each other. Not as mistress and servant, not as wife and enslaved woman, but as two people who'd both been destroyed by the same man. "You knew," Catherine whispered. "You knew he was going to do this." "He told me 3 days before he died." 3 days. Catherine's voice broke. "You had 3 days to prepare. I had none." Celia's face remained impassive. "I've had 13 years to prepare, Mrs. Ashford. 13 years of knowing that everything I had could be taken at any moment. 3 days' warning didn't change that." What followed was not a conversation. It was the unraveling of every pretense that had held Ashford Hall together. Judge Whittaker moved first. He was a federal judge, a man accustomed to authority, and he was not going to allow his daughter to be humiliated by an enslaved woman, even a newly freed one. "This will is invalid," he said. His voice cut through the room like a blade. "It violates Alabama law. It violates natural law. It will not stand." Pritchard turned to him. "Judge Whittaker, the will was properly executed. Your son-in-law was of sound mind. He had every legal right. He had no right to give a plantation to a Negro woman. The law is explicit. Freed people of color have severely restricted property rights in Alabama. She can't own land. She can't manage enslaved workers. She can't inherit a business. This will is legally impossible." "Your son-in-law anticipated these objections," Pritchard said quietly. "The will includes trust structures, provisions for white guardians to manage certain assets, legal mechanisms specifically designed." "I don't care what mechanisms he designed." Catherine's voice was ice. "This is my home, my children's inheritance, and I will see it burn before I let that woman take it." Celia met her eyes. "Then burn it, Mrs. Ashford. But when the ashes cool, it will still be mine." Thomas stepped forward. He was Nathaniel's brother, a respected attorney, and he'd been silent until now, watching, calculating. "We're going to contest this will," he said. "We're going to prove that my brother was mentally incompetent when he dictated it, that he was coerced, manipulated by a woman who used her position to extract undue influence. And we're going to expose exactly what kind of person you are, Celia. What you did to my brother. What you are." Celia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "Your brother purchased me, Mr. Ashford. Everything I did, everything I was, belonged to him. I couldn't refuse. I couldn't leave. I couldn't protect myself or my children. I was property. So if you want to talk about what I am, you'll first have to explain what he was." The legal challenge began immediately. Thomas Ashford filed a petition in Fairhope County Chancery Court 3 days after the will reading. The petition argued 3 primary points. First, Nathaniel had been mentally incompetent in his final weeks. Consumption had ravaged his body and mind. He'd been delirious, irrational, incapable of sound judgment. Second, Celia had exerted undue influence. She'd been in a position of intimate access. She'd manipulated a dying man, extracted promises, poisoned him against his legitimate family. Third, the will violated Alabama law. Even if Nathaniel could legally free Celia, he couldn't transfer property to her beyond minimal amounts. A freed black woman couldn't own a plantation, couldn't manage enslaved people, couldn't control business interests. The case was assigned to Judge Horace Caldwell, a man who'd served on the Alabama Supreme Court and had agreed to hear this particular case because of its unusual legal complexities. But everyone knew the real reason. Judge Caldwell had been friends with Judge Whitaker for 30 years. He'd dined at Ashford Hall. He'd benefited from Nathaniel's business connections, and he had every incentive to rule in favor of the Ashford family. The trial was scheduled for August 1857. Both sides began preparing. Thomas Ashford assembled a team of 3 attorneys. They spent months interviewing every person who'd ever worked at Ashford Hall, building a case not just against the will, but against Celia herself. Their strategy was clear: destroy her character so thoroughly that no judge could possibly rule in her favor. Pritchard, representing Celia, understood what was coming. He met with her in his office in late June. Celia sat across from him, her 3 children in the hallway outside: Ruth, Samuel, Grace, too young to understand what was about to happen, old enough to sense the danger. "Miss Celia," Pritchard said, and even using the honorific Miss felt strange to both of them. "The Ashford family is going to try to destroy you. They're going to argue that you seduced Nathaniel, manipulated him. They're going to say terrible things about you in open court. Are you prepared for that?" Celia looked at him steadily. "I've been called terrible things my entire life, Mr. Pritchard. A few more insults won't change anything." "It's not just insults. They're going to question your morality, your fitness as a mother. They're going to suggest you're unfit to manage property, that you're incapable of the responsibilities Nathaniel's will grants you. They're going to try to prove that giving you this inheritance would be dangerous, to you, to your children, to society." "And what do you suggest I do?" "Tell the truth, exactly as it happened. Don't embellish, don't perform, just tell the truth." Celia smiled. It was not a happy expression. "The truth, Mr. Pritchard, is that I was purchased by a man who wanted more than a bookkeeper. The truth is that I couldn't refuse him. The truth is that I bore his children, knowing they would be enslaved. The truth is that I lived in his house while his wife pretended I didn't exist. The truth is complicated and ugly, and it doesn't make anyone look good. Are you sure you want me to tell it?" Pritchard looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, because the only way we win this case is if the court understands that Nathaniel knew exactly what he was doing, that this will wasn't the product of confusion or manipulation. It was the product of guilt. And guilt, Miss Celia, is a very powerful legal argument." The trial began on August 10, 1857. Judge Caldwell's courtroom was packed beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles, crowded the hallway. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a public spectacle, a scandal that forced everyone in attendance to confront questions they'd spent lifetimes avoiding. Catherine attended every day. She dressed in mourning black, sat in the front row with her children. The message was clear: respectable white family destroyed by enslaved seductress. Celia sat on the opposite side of the courtroom with Pritchard. She wore the same plain gray dress every day, no jewelry, hair pulled back. She'd been advised to look humble, non-threatening, to perform deference even while fighting for millions of dollars. The performance required of both women said everything about the roles they were trapped in. Catherine had to perform wounded dignity. Celia had to perform grateful humility. Both were lies. Thomas Ashford opened with a speech that would be reprinted in newspapers across the South. Your Honor, this case is not merely about one man's will. It is about whether the foundations of our society can be maintained in the face of those who would pervert natural law. My brother, in his final illness, was corrupted by a woman who used her position to extract unnatural influence. This will is the product of that corruption, and we ask the court to restore what rightfully belongs to the Ashford family. Pritchard stood. He was older than Thomas, grayer, known for methodical, careful argument. Your Honor, the question is simple. Did Nathaniel Ashford have the legal right to dispose of his property as he chose? Mr. Thomas Ashford argues his brother was incompetent. I have physicians prepared to testify otherwise. He argues undue influence. I have Nathaniel's own letter explaining his reasoning. He argues the will violates Alabama law. I have trust structures designed to comply with every statute. Judge Caldwell listened, asked a few questions, then made a ruling that surprised both sides. This case raises complex legal questions. I'm ordering full proceedings. Both sides will present witnesses, evidence, expert testimony. We will examine Mr. Nathaniel Ashford's mental state, the validity of his relationship with Miss Celia, and whether Alabama law permits what this will attempts. He struck his gavel. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning. The first witness Thomas called was Catherine. She took the stand wearing black silk, her face composed. She'd been coached by her attorneys, knew exactly what to say. Thomas conducted the examination himself. Mrs. Ashford, how long were you married to Nathaniel? 23 years. And in that time, did you perform your duties faithfully? I bore him 5 children. I managed his household. I supported his business endeavors. I honored my vows, even when... She stopped, dabbed her eyes. Even when what, Mrs. Ashford? Even when I discovered he'd betrayed those vows. With her. Catherine's finger pointed directly at Celia. Pritchard stood to object, but Judge Caldwell waved him down. The witness may continue. Catherine's testimony was devastating. She described discovering Nathaniel's relationship with Celia in 1848, after Ruth was born. She described confronting him, his refusal to end the relationship. Years of humiliation. Watching her husband's mistress live in her house, raise his illegitimate children. Did you ever consider leaving? Thomas asked. Where would I go? A woman can't simply leave her marriage. I had children to think of, a reputation. I did what any Christian woman would do. I forgave him. I prayed. And he repaid me with this. She broke down crying. The jury watched with sympathy. 12 white men, all property owners, many married. They looked at Catherine and saw their wives. They looked at Celia and saw something else entirely. When Pritchard cross-examined, he was gentle but firm. Mrs. Ashford, you testified that you confronted your husband in 1848. What did he say? Catherine hesitated. He said the relationship was his private business. Did he ever promise to end it? No. Did he apologize? No. In fact, didn't he tell you explicitly that you would have to accept it? Catherine's face hardened. Yes. And you did accept it. For 9 years. You remained in the marriage. You continued to benefit from the plantation's income. You attended social functions with your husband. You maintained the appearance that everything was fine. I had no choice. You had the same choice as Celia had, Pritchard said quietly. The difference is you could have left. She couldn't. Thomas objected. Judge Caldwell sustained it. But the point had been made. Over the next several days, Thomas called witness after witness, servants, overseers, merchants who'd done business with Nathaniel, all describing Celia's unusual position at Ashford Hall, the power she'd held, the influence she'd wielded. But Pritchard's cross-examinations revealed something else. Respect. Almost every witness, when pressed, admitted that Celia had been fair, competent, kind even, that she'd helped people, protected them when she could. One witness, an elderly woman named Esther, who'd worked at Ashford Hall for 30 years, gave testimony that stopped the courtroom. Thomas asked her, "Did you observe the relationship between Celia and Mr. Nathaniel?" "I saw what there was to see." "Did it seem to you that she manipulated him?" Esther looked at Thomas with eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated by a white lawyer. "Mr. Thomas, you asking me if a woman who was property manipulated the man who owned her? That doesn't make sense. How's someone with no power supposed to manipulate someone with all the power? She bore his children, used them to... She bore his children because he came to her and she couldn't say no. That's not manipulation. That's what happens when one person owns another person. Your brother wasn't manipulated. He just finally admitted what he'd been doing." Thomas dismissed her quickly, but the damage was done. The most devastating testimony came from Dr. Benjamin Harrison, the physician who'd treated Nathaniel in his final months. Harrison was 70 years old, distinguished, highly respected. Thomas asked him, "Dr. Harrison, you treated my brother during his final illness. What was his condition?" "Consumption. Advanced. He was suffering significantly by early 1857. "Did the illness affect his mental capacity?" Harrison hesitated. "Consumption can cause delirium in advanced stages, fever, weakness. It's possible. In your professional opinion, was my brother capable of sound judgment?" And here Harrison looked genuinely troubled. "I believe his suffering may have impaired his judgment. Yes." But Pritchard's cross-examination was surgical. "Dr. Harrison, you say may have. Were you present when Mr. Nathaniel dictated his will?" "No." "Did you examine him that specific day?" "No." "Did he ever, in your presence, say anything that suggested confusion or mental incompetence?" Harrison shook his head slowly. "No. Nathaniel was always lucid when I saw him." "So your testimony about impaired judgment is speculation, based on my medical understanding of his condition. But you have no direct evidence." "No," Harrison admitted. "I don't." The turning point came when Pritchard called his own witness, himself. It was unusual, risky, but necessary. Because Pritchard had been present when Nathaniel dictated the will, he'd heard Nathaniel's reasoning firsthand, and his testimony would either save Celia or destroy her. Pritchard took the stand. Another attorney, brought in specifically for this moment, conducted the examination. "Mr. Pritchard, you drafted Mr. Nathaniel Ashford's final will, is that correct?" "Yes." "Please describe the circumstances." Pritchard pulled out his notes. "Mr. Nathaniel came to my office on February 18th, 1857. He said he was dying and wanted to change his will. We met over the course of 2 full days. He dictated everything clearly, purposefully." "What exactly did he say?" Pritchard looked at Catherine, then at Celia. Then he began to read. He said, "I'm dying, Samuel. I've made many mistakes, but I have a chance to correct one of them. I want to free Celia and provide for our children. I know this will destroy my relationship with my legitimate family. I know it will cause a scandal. But I would rather die honestly than live one more day lying to myself." The courtroom went silent. Thomas half rose from his chair. Pritchard continued. He said more. He said, "Catherine will never forgive me. My children will hate my memory. Society will condemn me. I accept that, because the alternative is dying knowing that I enslaved my own children, that I kept the woman I loved in bondage, that I was too much of a coward to face the truth." Catherine made a sound like she'd been struck. He said, "I've been a coward my whole life, Samuel. Let me at least die brave." Thomas stood. "Your Honor, this is hearsay. These are documented notes," Pritchard said, "taken contemporaneously. They're admissible." Judge Caldwell nodded slowly. "Continue." Pritchard looked directly at the jury. Nathaniel Ashford knew exactly what he was doing. He understood the consequences. He did it anyway. This will wasn't the product of confusion. It was the product of guilt. And guilt, gentlemen, is the clearest evidence of a sound mind. Celia never testified. Pritchard advised against it. The risk was too great. If she spoke, Thomas would tear her apart, accuse her of everything, force her to defend the indefensible. So she sat in silence, watching her life debated by men who would never understand what it meant to be property, to exist in the space between human and object, to bear children, knowing they belonged to someone else. The final arguments took an entire day. Thomas argued that the will violated law, morality, and social order. Pritchard argued that Nathaniel had exercised his legal rights and that guilt was not grounds for invalidation. Then Judge Caldwell asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "Mr. Pritchard, are you truly arguing that Alabama law should permit a Negro woman to own a plantation, to control enslaved workers, to exercise economic power reserved for white men?" And Pritchard, in what would become his most famous argument, responded, "Your Honor, I'm arguing that Alabama law already permits free people of color to own property. The legislature has restricted those rights, yes, but not eliminated them. If a white man can manumit enslaved people and provide for them, then Nathaniel Ashford exercised that right. The fact that he provided generously, rather than minimally, doesn't make it illegal. It makes it unusual. But the magnitude, the law doesn't specify a cap on inheritance, Your Honor. It restricts rights after inheritance. Miss Celia will still face every legal restriction free people of color face. She won't vote. She won't testify against whites. But owning property? The law permits that." Judge Caldwell sat back. Everyone knew what he was thinking. Rule for Celia, and he'd be saying Alabama law permitted a formerly enslaved woman to become one of the wealthiest people in the state. Rule against her, and he'd have to invent legal reasoning that didn't exist in statute. "I'll issue my ruling in 30 days, he said. Those 30 days felt interminable. At Ashford Hall, an uneasy truce settled over the property. Catherine remained in the main house. Celia stayed in her small house with the children. Neither woman crossed into the other's space. The enslaved people existed in limbo. They didn't know who owned them, whether they'd be sold, whether anything would change. A man named Isaiah, who'd worked at Ashford Hall for 20 years, later described the psychological torment. "We didn't know if we should hope Miss Celia won or lost. If she won, we'd be owned by someone who'd been enslaved herself. If she lost, we'd probably be sold. Either way, our lives weren't ours." On September 15, 1857, Judge Caldwell issued his ruling. The courtroom was packed. Catherine sat in her usual place, Celia beside Pritchard, everyone holding their breath. Judge Caldwell looked exhausted. He'd aged visibly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who knew his decision would satisfy no one. "I have spent these 30 days in careful consideration of the law, the evidence, and the principles at stake. What I am about to say will disappoint both parties." Celia's heart hammered. "First, regarding mental capacity, I find that the evidence supports the conclusion that Mr. Nathaniel Ashford was of sound mind when he dictated his will. This will was not the product of delirium or diminished capacity." Catherine made a small sound. "Second, regarding undue influence, I find no evidence that Miss Celia coerced or manipulated Mr. Ashford. The relationship, while morally troubling to many, does not constitute legal undue influence." Thomas's face darkened. "However," Judge Caldwell continued, and that word made everyone tense, "I must address the fundamental legal question. Can Alabama law permit what this will attempts?" He paused, looked at Celia. Miss Celia would become one of the largest property owners in the county. She would control enslaved workers, manage business interests. The question is not whether Mr. Ashford had the right to free you. He did. The question is whether he could transfer this magnitude of property to a freed person of color. On this point, the law is ambiguous. Pritchard leaned forward. "Therefore, I am ruling that the will is valid, with modifications." The courtroom erupted. "Miss Celia shall receive her freedom, custody of her children. These provisions are unambiguous and legal." Celia felt tears running down her face. Her children were free. However, I cannot allow the transfer of the entire estate. Such a transfer would violate the spirit of Alabama law. Therefore, I order the following. Miss Celia shall receive the north tract of Ashford Hall, approximately 900 acres, with buildings thereon. She shall receive $40,000 in liquid assets held in trust. The remainder of the estate shall be divided among the legitimate heirs. Catherine gasped. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Furthermore, the enslaved workers shall be divided between the two estates. Miss Celia shall not own enslaved people. The court finds this unconscionable given her recent status. Celia felt the decision like a blow. She'd fought so hard, and still, the fundamental injustice continued. This ruling, Caldwell concluded, attempts to honor Nathaniel Ashford's intentions while respecting legal and social realities. Both parties have 30 days to appeal. He struck his gavel. Adjourned. Neither side appealed. Catherine's attorneys wanted to. Thomas wanted to fight for the full estate. But Catherine, looking across the courtroom at Celia one final time, seemed to reach some conclusion. No, she said. No more. I'm tired of fighting over a dead man. The property division took months. By spring 1858, Celia took possession of her 900 acres. A house, smaller than the main hall, but substantial. The trust fund was established. She had money, land, freedom. Her children had futures. But she also had isolation. Fairhope Society never accepted her. White merchants refused to deal with her. She had to conduct business through intermediaries. Her children were educated at home. Too black for white schools, too wealthy for others, too ambiguous to fit anywhere. The enslaved workers were divided, families separated, lives destroyed. Celia watched it happen and wept, because she understood now what Nathaniel's will had actually done. It had saved her children, but it had saved only them. She couldn't save anyone else. That was the bargain. Catherine and her children took the South Tract and city properties. The cotton business was sold. Catherine remarried in 1860, moved away. Her children scattered. None ever returned. Celia lived at Ashford Hall's North Tract until 1881. She saw her children grow, marry, have children of their own. Ruth became a teacher, Samuel a minister. Grace married and moved north. She died owning the land Nathaniel had given her. Her will divided it among her children and grandchildren. A black family owning 900 acres in Alabama, an impossibility before the war, a fragile reality after. But here's what history doesn't record. After Celia died, her children found letters, hidden in a locked box, letters Nathaniel had written to her over the years, letters that revealed a man tortured by contradictions. One letter, written in 1851, read, Eliza, I tell myself what we have is love, that because I value you, because I plan to free you someday, our relationship is different. But late at night, I know the truth. You can't refuse me. You can't leave. How can anything built on such foundations be love? I'm addicted to the fantasy that you want me. I'm a monster pretending to be a man. Another, from 1856. I've decided to change my will, give you everything. Catherine will hate me. My children will curse me. But I need to believe one act of honesty can redeem a lifetime of lies. I know it doesn't. I know there's no redemption. But I have to try. Those letters reveal what the trial never addressed. Nathaniel's will wasn't love. It was confession, a desperate attempt to buy absolution for crimes he couldn't undo. He freed Celia not because it was right, but because he couldn't face dying with the lie intact. And in doing so, he forced everyone to confront truths they'd spent lifetimes denying. But did it matter? His legitimate children were destroyed. Catherine spent years fighting for scraps. Celia won property but lost community. The enslaved workers were scattered. And Alabama law remained unchanged. The ruling allowed just enough exception to prove the system was fair while changing nothing fundamental. So what does this story mean? Perhaps the lesson is this: there are some crimes you can't make amends for, some wrongs that can't be righted by good intentions or deathbed confessions. Nathaniel spent 13 years committing daily violations against Celia's humanity, against his own children's freedom. Then he tried to fix it with a legal document. But you can't unenslave someone. You can't give back stolen years. Freedom given as a gift isn't the same as freedom claimed as a right. And a deathbed confession doesn't absolve a lifetime of choosing comfort over courage. The case of Nathaniel Ashford and Celia forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The antebellum South wasn't just obvious villains and innocent victims. It was a system that corrupted everyone. Masters who convinced themselves they were benevolent, wives who pretended not to see, children raised to accept brutality as normal, and enslaved people forced to survive however they could. Nathaniel's will didn't fix that system. It just revealed how completely broken it was. You couldn't be good and own people. You couldn't love someone and enslave them. You couldn't build wealth on stolen lives and pretend a generous inheritance made up for it. Nathaniel died trying to believe he could. Celia lived knowing he couldn't. And their children, all of them, paid the price. The north tract of Ashford Hall still exists, private property now, owned by descendants through Ruth's line. The house has been restored, beautiful, white columns, sweeping porches. But if you stand there, you can still feel the weight of impossible choices made in that place, of people trying to be good within a system designed to make goodness impossible, of lives destroyed by those who thought they were being kind. This story matters because these contradictions didn't end with slavery. The patterns persist. The excuses evolve. The fundamental question remains: can you make amends for participating in evil? Or are some prices too high to ever be paid? History doesn't answer that question. It just forces us to keep asking it. And sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones where everyone involved thought they were doing the right thing. The years that followed were not kind to anyone touched by Nathaniel Ashford's will. History has a way of remembering the dramatic moments, the courtroom battles, the shocking revelations, the public scandals. But it forgets the slow erosion that comes after, the daily humiliations, the generational trauma, the way one man's attempt at redemption rippled outward, creating waves of destruction that wouldn't settle for decades. Catherine remarried in 1860, just 3 years after the trial. His name was Robert Sinclair, a Charleston merchant 20 years her senior. It was not a love match. It was survival. Catherine needed financial stability. Sinclair needed social connections. They performed the marriage for exactly 4 years, until Sinclair died at the Battle of Vicksburg in 1864. Catherine never remarried again. She lived until 1879, dying in a boarding house in Mobile, far from Ashford Hall, far from the life she'd once believed was hers by right. Her children scattered like seeds in wind. Jonathan moved to Texas, changed his surname to Sinclair, and never spoke of his father again. Mary married a minor politician and died in childbirth at 29. Charlotte became a school teacher in Charleston, never married, and kept a journal that would be discovered a century later, filled with entries about shame, about legacy, about trying to understand why her father had chosen to destroy them. William drank himself to death by 40. Rebecca, the youngest, was the only one who seemed to find peace. She moved to Philadelphia, married an abolitionist attorney, and spent her life working with freed people during Reconstruction. In a letter written in 1885, she reflected on her father. "I have spent my life trying to undo what he built. Perhaps that is the only inheritance worth keeping." Celia's life was longer, but no less lonely. She lived on her 900 acres until 1881, managing the land with the same meticulous care she'd once given to Nathaniel's accounts. But the isolation was profound. White society never accepted her. The free black community respected her but kept their distance. She was too wealthy, too compromised, too connected to the system that had oppressed them all. She existed in between, neither fully free nor fully enslaved by the past. Her children thrived, relatively speaking. Ruth became a teacher at a school for freed people in Montgomery. She married a minister and had 4 children of her own. She died in 1923 at 75, having lived long enough to see her grandchildren enter a world slightly less brutal than the one she'd been born into. Samuel became a minister like his brother-in-law. He traveled throughout Alabama during Reconstruction, preaching to freed communities about dignity and resistance. He was murdered in 1871 by white vigilantes who objected to his organizing work. He was 20 years old. Grace, the youngest, moved north in 1875. She married in Ohio, had 3 children, and lived until 1941. She never returned to Alabama, never spoke of Ashford Hall. When her children asked about her childhood, she would say only, "That was another life. This is the one that matters." But here is what haunts this story most. In 1890, 9 years after Celia's death, a historian researching antebellum legal cases discovered something in the Fairhope County archives, a document that had been filed but never entered into the official court record. It was a letter, written by Nathaniel Ashford, dated February 1st, 1857, 6 weeks before his death, addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone. The letter read, "I am writing this because I cannot die without saying what I have spent my life refusing to say. I purchased a human being. I convinced myself it was acceptable because I was kind to her, because I planned to free her someday, because I loved her. But kindness from an owner is not kindness. It is control wearing a gentler mask. Love between owner and owned is not love. It is violence pretending to be something else. I have spent 13 years committing a crime I called a relationship. I have fathered children I kept enslaved, while telling myself I would free them when the time was right. As if there is ever a right time to delay someone's freedom. As if I had the right to decide when they became fully human in the eyes of the law. This will is not redemption. It is confession. I am not freeing Celia. I am admitting I never should have owned her. I am not providing for my children with her. I am acknowledging they should never have been my property to begin with. And I know that this admission destroys the people I claimed to love. My wife, who performed loyalty for 23 years while I betrayed her. My legitimate children, who will inherit nothing but shame. Celia herself, who will spend the rest of her life fighting for what I'm giving her, knowing it will never be enough to compensate for what I took. This is not an act of love. It is an act of cowardice dressed as courage. I am dying, so I am finally telling the truth. But I am only able to tell it because I will not have to live with the consequences. Everyone else will. That letter was never read in court, never entered into evidence. It simply existed, filed away, forgotten, until someone found it. And even then, it changed nothing. Because by 1890, everyone involved was either dead or scattered. The story had already been told. The lesson had already been learned. Or perhaps not learned at all. Because the same patterns continued, the same excuses, the same attempts to redeem irredeemable wrongs with gestures that cost the giver nothing. Nathaniel Ashford's will did not change Alabama law. It did not prevent other families from keeping their mixed-race children enslaved. It did not challenge the fundamental structures of a society built on ownership of human beings. It simply created a spectacle, a scandal, a story people would whisper about for generations. And perhaps that is the real horror. Not that Nathaniel failed to redeem himself, but that he never really tried. He simply shifted the burden of his guilt onto everyone else and called it love. The north tract of Ashford Hall exists today as private property, still owned by descendants of Ruth. The house has been renovated, modernized. But the land remembers. And if you stand there, if you let yourself feel the weight of what happened in that place, you understand that some debts can never be paid, some wounds never heal, some ghosts never leave. They just wait. In the archives, in the soil, in the stories we tell ourselves about redemption and justice, and whether any of us are brave enough to face the truth about what we've inherited. This is not a story with a moral. It is simply a story about what happens when the lies we live by finally break, and about who pays the price when they do.